Hello and welcome to Risk at Work, Risk Connect's educational web series. I'm Scott Fenstermaker. I'm the VP of Digital Marketing. Today we're talking about the policy playbook for organizational resilience. You know, coming up with a resilient strategy for your organization is crucial, but it's also the easy part of what goes on with resilience. Much harder is actually ensuring that your organization is executing these wonderful resilient policies that you've thought so long and hard about. And that becomes an ongoing struggle, especially in our times now as volatility increases, as organizations are facing more. Resilience becomes an ongoing battle for clarity and streamlining policies and processes. These things require increased accessibility, accountability, transparency, clarity, simplicity, buy-in. None of these things are easy and none of these things come for free. So today we're going to be talking about how exactly to implement these things effectively within your organization and handing you the playbook for resilience within your organization. And we have the perfect person to be talking with us today about this, friend of the webinar. She's back. Before I introduce her, though, a couple of housekeeping items. If you have questions for our guest today, please put them into the question field in your webinar software. If the conversation does not answer the question, we will reach out to you directly with an answer. Also, if you indicated that you would like to receive CPE credit for attending this webinar, please watch your inbox. After we're done here today, we're going to send you a short quiz. You fill it out, you return it, and we will reply with your CPE credit. All right, let's welcome her back. Founder and Chief Resilience Officer at Asphalis Advisors. She is an adjunct professor and a board advisor. She is the host of the Business Resilience Decoded podcast with over 40,000 downloads and subscribers. She is noted as a Mecklenburg Times 50 Most Influential Women honoree. I am very proud to welcome back Vanessa Mathews. Vanessa, how are you doing?
I'm good, Scott. How are you doing?
Oh, that's good to see you, Vanessa. I'm always good when we get to have you back on here.
Well, it's a joy to be seen.
Excellent. That's exactly the right way to answer that question. I'm so happy. All right, so you're going to save our organizations today. You're going to actually, as opposed to planning to have them be resilient, you are going to actually help us become resilient, which is the tricky bit in this. So we're all anxious, we're all agog, we're sitting forward in our chairs, waiting to learn from you. So why don't you come and school us on this?
Yeah, happy to. So, what we're looking at right now is what are we going to talk about today? So, this agenda is designed to take this audience through a comprehensive exploration of organizational resilience. And going back to the title of today's webinar, the policy and process playbook. So, we'll talk about the foundations of the 4Ps, as we call it, the core of resilience, which are the systems that we need in place to make these things happen. We'll talk about how do we craft effective policies, how do we streamline the processes, the power of the playbooks, and then it all goes back to accountability and communication. So, so in setting the stage, in today's world, businesses are experiencing volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, known as the VUCA world. And resilience has risen as the cornerstone of what needs to be happening or what needs to be fully functioning in order for these businesses to endure success. So it's critical for companies to think about and discuss these critical topics. And through today, we're going to navigate the intricacies of how to adapt to these things and not just survive, but thrive. So what's interesting is that in today's landscape, companies, people, and business are finding ourselves in a reality where businesses are struggling with rapid change and many ways of how it's showing up within their organization. So if we go back to COVID and the 2019 to or the 2020 to 2022 era, this showed up twofold with supply chain disruptions and inflation. So on average, data shows that 44 or 45% of businesses reported supply chain disruptions during COVID. By April of 2022, domestic suppliers had increased to 44%. Additionally, about 78% of US small businesses reported experiencing price increases. And in many cases, this stressed and challenged most of these businesses with rapid changes. And so that's something for us to think about is how are different types of companies experiencing challenges and change? And then the other part about this, as we set this stage, is what's the maturity of organizational resilience? Meaning, where are people commonly thinking that they are versus where they actually are from a resiliency perspective? So, one question I always ask our clients is, okay, if we can recover from that, what's the data that tells us that? What data are we paying attention to? Is it because we have a feeling, or is there data to show that we can actually recover the things that we're here to support the organization on? And thirdly, the building blocks of resilience. In order to do the two things above, to navigate the uncertainty, to mature the organization, there has to be clear systems, accountability, and effective communication. So this is really what we're going to hone in and talk about today. So let's talk about the basics. Policies are the what. It sets the guidelines and the expectations for behavior and operations within the organization. If a policy doesn't exist, it's probably not going to happen. Secondly, we have our processes. This is our how. So what are the steps that we're going to take to help us to achieve our goals as an organization? Thirdly, we have the playbooks. This is the when or the if. And these are the specific guidances or the scenarios that we have in place to help us to execute. And then we have the practices. And the practices are the habits. And these are the daily actions that reflect the policies and procedures and how it shows up within the organization. It's how these things get integrated to really drive a culture of resilience and accountability within the organization. So as an example, a tech company might have a cybersecurity policy, which is the what, a process for regularly scheduled security audits, which is the how, a playbook for how they manage a breach response, which is the when, and then the daily security checks, which are the habits. Those are the practices to help enable these 4 Ps. So as you think about your program, where do these 4 Ps exist within your program? Whether it's security, enterprise risk, continuity, it doesn't matter. Where are these 4 Ps? And if there are breakdowns in communication and accountability and execution and understanding, go back to these 4 Ps and think about, is my what clear? Is my how clear? Is my when clear? Are the habits clear? And that might help you to pinpoint how to minimize and close some of those gaps. So with clarity around the basics of today's conversation, now let's talk about clear systems. So I have a friend of mine, her name is Natasha Hemingway, and she always says, clear is kind. The more clear you can be, the more kind it is. So how do we help to eliminate the guesswork so people don't have to guess what we need, what the expectation is, and how to make this to be successful, and also how it adds value to them? So the power of clarity is that it provides power. And it's simple. Clear systems mean fewer mistakes and smarter decisions for the organization and for you. This is easier to affect, and anyone, regardless of the maturity of the program, has the ability to be able to do this. Some of the work that we've experienced over the years with our customers shows that organizations with clear systems see an upwards of 30% increase in operational efficiency. So just by having clarity in a system, data shows that you're 30% more operationally efficient. A Forbes article recently published showed that a study determined that up to 80% of employee time is lost because of unproductive activities and general confusion. So think about 40 hours in a week. If 80% of my time I'm lost and unproductive because of unclear systems, what's that costing your organization? If you take my salary for the week and multiply that by 80%, what's that number in your business? Right? So clear systems help to eliminate ambiguity. It ensures that everyone understands their role and responsibilities, and it helps to produce and boost productivity and adaptability. So as you think about this, how do we translate this to what's that conversation like for a resilience professional? So, where in your process, again, risk, security, emergency management, it doesn't matter. Where in your process might there be unclear systems? Where is there confusion? Where are we spending more time than what's needed? And how much is it costing you? And when we go back to how do we add value, well, how do you quantify the amount of time that's been wasted to put that in front of a senior leader or a group of stakeholders who you need buy-in from to help them see the dollars? So for example, we were preparing for a presentation with an organization, and we have a process for how we do that. And what we saw was that in this particular process, we spent 17 more hours doing something that should have took 2 hours. So what we said is, okay, well, what's the gap here? The gap is there's an issue with the process because no one seems to be following what we think the process is. So let's go back to what's documented. And where in this process map are we missing the mark? And so we found that spot. So what it created was we have an action to go update this process, ensure that it's followed by all, because this can never happen again. We don't have time to spend 17 hours on something that should only be taking 2 hours. But you won't know that until your processes are documented, right? So that's a critical component to your resiliency programs are clarity in your systems, but you can't, processes create systems, systems create fortunes. You can't have a system until you have a process. So how do we build effective policies? So high level, it's 3 buckets. You have to craft them with clarity. They have to be flexible. We always say we need flexibility in the design because things are going to change. And then you have to reflect your culture. And so when I think about flexibility, right, all of our clients, when we say the word business continuity in front of a C-suite executive, they look like, what is that? So my personal definition is something that impacts your people, your technology, your suppliers, and your buildings. I really don't care what the crisis is. It really doesn't matter. But those are the 4 losses that we're preparing for. They can wrap their head around those words because they see those line items on their P&L, on the balance sheet. It's what they're accountable for, what they're responsible for. So they understand that. And so that framework of those 4 things from a BCP perspective gives them flexibility for the future. So when we're building a plan or a continuity of operations playbook, they're thinking about, all right, I'm here to protect these 4 losses. And that's it. I'm not here for the zombie apocalypse. I'm not here for the cyber breach because those are all one-off things. And so this helps them to think about how do we build something that's effective for everybody.
I'm still back on the idea that you say the word business continuity to executive leadership even today, and they still meet you with what is that? That part of that, even just saying that is a little bit scary. That this vocabulary hasn't sunk into leadership levels. Is this really something that you experience?
Yeah. So what I have observed is if you are in a position of chief security officer, risk officer, if you own supply chain, you get it, right? Because they're like us, like they understand the language. But when we're talking to the general counsel, the head of finance, um, the head of marketing or the head of HR, or even a CEO, most of them, how they define business continuity is not what you would hear at an industry conference. In their mind, it's something
I see.
completely different. Or they'll say the words, they're describing an enterprise risk management program, but they're talking
Mhm.
about continuity. So
Got
we
it.
have to level set on, well, let's agree on definitions so
So
we can
repeat
make
just
sure that
for
we,
everybody, just make sure everybody heard it. What were the 4 things that in your definition make up business continuity? Just to repeat it and make sure everybody heard it.
yeah. So it's your people, your suppliers, your facilities, and your technology.
Great.
And for some clients, it changes. So for our airport clients, they don't focus on suppliers, they focus on communications, because it's such a major deal that you can communicate inside the airport, before they get to the airport, as they're leaving their home, that's a much bigger issue. Or for some of them, it's critical systems. What are all the systems that it takes to run an airport? And if those things fail, it is detrimental to their business, and they feel that impact immediately. Yep. So research indicates that clear communication during policy setup significantly increases the likelihood of successful implementation. So this is essential for policies to be understood and adopted throughout the organization. So basically, the governance is absolutely critical. And we've even started to kind of rethink about how do we better engage senior leadership on the front end, so that we can clearly communicate what's the goal and objective of the resiliency or continuity programs that we're implementing for the organization. An adaptable policy framework, as advised by McKinsey, should be modular to allow for agility in addressing your emerging issues. This means that distributing your decision-making and execution across parts of your company, rather than centralizing your control, could be more effective for some companies. So now we're going to transition into designing efficient processes and getting on some of the how. So the blueprint for success is obviously key steps for effective outcomes, consistency, helping you to meet your flexibility. The more consistent you are, the better it is for the organization. And then optimization, making sure that you're building things that can be ongoing and that can continuously evolve and refine as your organization continues to change. So what are the key steps for effective process design? So number one, clear objectives. Begin with a clear understanding of what you're aiming to achieve with your processes. Begin with the end in mind and align them back to the organizational goals to ensure every step drives you towards your strategic vision. So we're talking to a retail company now, and they are a purpose-driven company. So everything that they do goes back to their purpose. So when they say the words, I need a crisis management program and structure, the first question that came up in our meeting, how does this tie back to the vision, the purpose, and the why of this company? And if that crisis management program doesn't fit into that purpose, it's a no-go, right? Second step is mapping out the standard procedures. Develop a roadmap of standard procedures that we need in place, and ensure that the steps are clear, actionable, and measurable, because this provides you the consistency within your framework for you to learn and for your team to be able to operate within. So if I'm building a crisis management program or a framework, there's a process, there's a structure for how that happens, for what needs to be ongoing, what needs to be continuous. And we've got to take the time to map those steps in, because again, processes create systems, systems create fortunes. Part three is balance with adaptability. So while standardizing is vital, your processes must allow room for adaptation and for you to meet what's changing and what's evolving in your business. So again, build with flexibility without losing sight. And then lastly, in order to design efficient processes, we have to build with a continuous improvement mindset. So adapting those principles to integrate regular reviews and feedback loops into your processes, so we can also understand, well, what's changing, what's working, what's helping, what's not helping, so we have better clarity around that. So these are the steps. And then lastly, what you want to do is to evaluate and realign. As you get that feedback loop, go back and spend some time changing and updating. Just like we tell people to do with the BCP plan every year, what are some of your processes and systems that you need to go back and reevaluate? So for example, same company that's purpose-driven, they developed a crisis management program back in 2014 to 16. The process for how they did that was not heavily documented or not shared by all. And so now they're in a position where the entire leadership team has changed over a 10-year period or a 9-year period. The culture has changed drastically. And so now they're having to go back and realign. Well, how do we rebuild what we had before? Because some people there knew what that structure looked like and the value of it, but many people who are there today don't. The process might still work, but now we have a different way that we have to go back and execute it. And so these are steps that are going to help you to create a better system for the programs that you're operating in. So how do you build playbooks for success? Playbooks serve as a critical resource to help you build a routine operation to help you manage the things that you cannot see. Comprehensive guides provide you step-by-step instructions and help you tailor it to various scenarios. So your playbooks should be indispensable. They should ensure that the safety, the operational integrity that you want to maintain and uphold are at a high standard and that they're upheld during high pressure situations. A playbook probably is not going to be the best tool to have. A playbook is going to be most effective if you build it for the flexibility. So for example, we have an organization outside of the way that we define business continuity, right? The people, the suppliers, the facilities, and the technology. Well, they wanted 5 more things because they're in the healthcare sector of here's the additional 5 things that matter to us and our business that we have to make sure that we're building into our playbooks. And so what we've had to do is work with each of those departments to say, here's our 4 plus your 5, which equals 9. Here's the 9 scenarios that we're planning for at any given point in time. And so whether you are pharmacy, whether you are administration, whether you are operations, how do we ensure that this aspect of your business can meet the needs of these 9 components of this plan? A couple of months ago, maybe a month or 2 ago, a pretty significant healthcare organization had a data breach. And we looked back at this client, and in their BIA, we could see that company X, Y, and Z who experienced the breach was a sole provider of all of their pharmacy services that they offer to their customers. And this is a behavioral healthcare company, which means people could not access and get their prescriptions. So how many people for how many days went without access to what they needed? How many people may have had to come out of pocket because they were not able to get those expenses reimbursed? And so for us, it was an opportunity to reach back out and say, hey, like we just finished this plan a month ago, and now it's a real life scenario. How are we building this? How are we talking about this internally? And what conversations are you guys having with this vendor? And this particular vendor has about a 40% capacity where they're supporting the majority of the healthcare systems across the United States. So if you take that one company that we're working with, times it by significantly more, how many people had an impact? Personal story, my dad was a person, he couldn't get his prescriptions filled. And he said, and he's a construction worker, so he's like anti-resiliency and like, you know, outside of meeting OSHA requirements, my dad has no clue what we do. And he was like, yeah, somebody said it was a data breach. And I was like, oh my gosh. It's the same breach that our clients have. So real life example of it's in my playbook, we have the plan, and now the real thing happens. So now what are we doing? So what are some steps to help you create effective playbooks? And when I say playbooks, that could be your BCP playbooks, but it can also be how do you run an effective department as a resiliency or emergency management department or team. It doesn't have to be the plans that everybody is relying on you for. So number 1, identify your critical scenarios. What are the scenarios that you need clear guidance on when something happens? And this can range from daily operations to a crisis. Step 2, develop step-by-step instructions for each of those scenarios and provide action steps. And that ensures that your team members have a clear roadmap. One of the things that we've done too is I really charge my team with ask better questions. The better you can ask questions, the better data you will receive and the better we can execute. Number three, customize to your needs. So tailor your playbooks to the unique context of your company and ensure that it's relevant to support your operational realities. I can't tell you how many people I meet that say, oh, I'll just go copy so-and-so's playbook because we're the same business. And it's like, yeah, but your culture is different and your boss doesn't really care. Her boss does care. So help me understand how a copy and paste is going to work here. Um, Step 4, ensure accessibility. Make your playbooks easily accessible to those who need access to it. Clear language, intuitive design, so that everybody can utilize them in the way that they need to. Include scenario spotlights as an option. You can incorporate real life scenarios or use cases to help to illustrate that. And this helps users to understand how to practically use this as a guide. And then lastly, of course, update it regularly so that it maintains the relevance or the things that may have changed or evolved. So this is how you build a playbook for success.
So as we're talking about a literal playbook here, as we're talking about by which we mean documentation for this, just to make sure everybody has an idea of what this actually looked like. Is this scenario based? So this is scenario based documentation, as it sounds like, or vendor X gets a data breach, vendor Y has a defect, hiring unusual hiring scarcity in a certain profession. Is that what we're talking about here? Give us a sense of what this looks like and feels like when we were looking at it.
Yeah, I would say yes, yes, and. So if I go back to a recent playbook example, we talked about for a particular department, what's the role of this department? What is the objective? What's in scope? What's out of scope? That way we're clear about the guardrails of what isn't entailed here. Um, if your primary leader is unavailable, what are the levels of approval or delegation that we need to map out? So if you're finance, who can approve X amount of dollars on an invoice versus when this person is not here, what's the contingency? What's the backup? And then from there, if you look at, we'll keep this same example. If it's a finance organization, there's a lot of functions within finance. So you might be the VP of finance, and there might be 20 departments who report to the VP of finance because there's 20 different functions that you are carrying out, right? So what are those critical functions, which might be different playbooks? Or some departments may say, I am responsible for 5 critical functions. And then from there, what we're looking at is, based on this function, what are the 4 losses that we're preparing for? What are the technologies? What are the applications? And then now let's get into what's the real story? How are you actually going to recover? Don't worry about IT. Don't worry about anybody else. What specifically is your department going to do when you lose this key resource or this key talent pool or this key application or this key facility? How are you going to physically go and do your job?
Right. Right.
Does
Okay.
that
Thank
help?
you. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Awesome. So after we think about the foundations, the policies, the processes, the plans, or the playbooks, and we understand how do we set those things up for success, the next big question is, what does implementing accountability look like? And so when I think about accountability, it's really high level 3 things, right? It's responsibility, which is driven by culture. It's measuring. What gets measured gets managed. And then it's leading by example. So we took a look at the Harvard Business Review recently, and there's data that shows that 82% of managers acknowledge that they have limited to no ability to hold people accountable successfully. Think about that. 82%, limited to no ability. And 91%,
I know that my team just walks all over me, so that in fact checks out. That's true. Yes.
91% of employees in the same Harvard Business review report showed that employees would say that effectively holding others accountable is one of their company's top leadership development needs. They're not effective in that. So that research also confirms how insignificant today's accountability systems make employees feel. So here's a few data points that I'm going to share. Gallup found that 14% of employees feel their performance is managed in a way that motivates them. 14. What's 14 minus 100? Big difference. 26% get feedback less than once a year. That's over 70% of your time. You're not getting feedback. 21% feel like their performance metrics are within their control, which means 80% of people feel like it's not. 40% of people feel as if their manager holds them accountable for goals that they set, which means 60% say that they don't. And to add to that, 70% of employees feel their managers are not objective in how they evaluate their performance. That's significant. So that means that it comes to no surprise that 69% of employees do not feel they are living up to their potential at work. So let's just sit in that. That's a lot of data points. And if I summed it up, over 50% of people are not getting what they need, when they need it, and how they need it to be effective. So how can you implement accountability if we're not being responsible in how we're communicating or what we're communicating? How can we implement accountability if the data shows something different? How can we implement accountability if we're not leading by example? So implementing accountability is a huge part of your policies, your processes, your plans, your playbooks, the sustainability of an organization. So let's take the process of what we do out of it, right? Like, hey, my job is risk, and I'm here to report risk to the board. You have an organization, you have a department, you have a team, you have stakeholders that you're leading. Do those stakeholders understand the expectation? We have a client that is in the Midwest, and they're a foundation. They just achieved $1 billion in their fund. And so they're thinking about the level of risk that they now need to start considering, because you're now a target to some organizations because of how much money you built into your fund. And they have a risk committee that they hold every quarter. So they've recently invited us to the risk committee. And after we did our presentation, the CEO said, this is as important, if not more important, than enterprise risk management. And I want this communicated at the board level. And I was just like, I've never heard anybody say that about business continuity. So shout out to you, boss. And so when we were invited to the first risk committee meeting, we spent some time prepping to make sure we knew how to come in and support and add value. Which step one was to listen, because we've never been to one of these for this particular company. And so we asked the questions. We asked the questions of, what are some things that you're experiencing in this committee meeting? How's it going? What's the value add? And the client said, I don't know why I'm in these meetings. I don't know the value of what we're getting. And quite frankly, we spent all of our time last year focused on one risk that never happened. The biggest risk that disrupted our company was the fact that we lost a significant portion of our workforce. And so what it made me go back to is, so wait a minute, you got the entire C-suite in an hour-and-a-half meeting quarterly to talk about risks. And collectively, the feedback is, I don't know why I'm in this meeting.
That's scary. That's scary. Now, hang on. I want to ask a follow-up question on that, because so I think your story speaks for itself. That clearly the communication there was insufficient, and there were lots of problems going on there. But one of the things that interacted with that scenario that you just talked about was the idea that continuity planning, resiliency planning, very often is concentrated on risks that don't materialize. There, in fact, there's a good chance that if you have strong ERM and you have strong continuity and you have strong processes, it will actually make risks uh, 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 less likely to materialize in certain cases, right? So, can there be? Is that a common attitude, right? And is it wrong to focus on risks that don't materialize if those risks are indeed majorly impactful to your business if they do materialize? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I don't think it's wrong, but what I do think is not helpful is the lack of communication. So
Right.
in this scenario, it's another vendor that's leading this effort for this particular client, and they've had that relationship for a while.
Hmm.
So number one, right? If I go back to the data points that I shared from Gallup, 26% of people said that they get feedback less than once a year. So now my
Right.
question is, as the client, when are you giving your vendors feedback? Or as a vendor, how often are you asking your clients for the feedback? Um, 40% of people say that their manager feels like they hold them accountable for goals that they set, which means 60% don't. So then that's my question. So as the client, are you holding your vendor accountable? If you feel like you're wasting your time in a meeting, when are you going to say that? Because the
See.
way that they described this meeting, I was like, I don't know if. So what I do know is I don't ever want my company to be described the way that.
Right. I don't know what I'm doing here. Exactly right.
That was my concern.
I think that's like everybody's fear, right?
So I think that right there, Scott, is I think
Yeah.
the key word is, are you okay with asking the real question as an
Right.
individual to get the real data?
And the operative dynamic here is that they never ask the vendor the question. They never even, do you understand the value of this? Are you getting value from this? Are you, I see.
Yeah. And with some of our clients, so I always say in this profession, you can either be a vendor or a competitor or a partner. It just depends on the day of the week. And sometimes you're both, right?
Hmm.
Well, what I've learned about some of our clients is they work with a lot of different companies that we compete with, and sometimes ones that we don't. And what I've heard consistently is many people are not asking them, how's it going? How did we do? Did we deliver on what we said that we could do? How's the communication?
Yeah.
And they're not collecting that data and they're not asking, which means the client's either not telling you, or when it's time for that renewal, they've already started dating somebody else,
Mhm.
or they're talking about you behind your back and you don't know it. And so I think that's the challenge, is how do we create an atmosphere where people can ask for feedback? Because it's not okay for you to come to work and feel ineffective and unproductive and have poor communication, because we know it's costing you.
Sure.
Not only is it costing your business on the bottom line, it's costing you as the worker, which means it like there's a mental component and there's a level of confidence that's now changing because you don't feel like you're bringing your best self to work because the cards are stacked against you,
Right.
right?
Makes
And
sense.
all of what we're talking about today, you can't do it without people. Like AI is great, but it's not that great.
That's another topic I'm sure we'll be coming back to, but at a later time. Yes, please go on.
So, another core tenet of resilience lies in your organization's capacity to adapt the core strategies that address the unique risks and vulnerabilities. And so, what we know as resilience professionals, that could mean anything from risk assessments to resilience building measures to continuity planning to creating a culture of risk. So, whether you're a nonprofit, a startup, a multinational corporation, all of these organizations must change or adapt their approach for clear systems, accountability, and communication in different ways to ensure that these things are reinforcing the outcomes that you may want, whether it's continuity outcomes, whether it's resiliency outcomes, whatever the outcomes are for your business. So what are some examples or some context that we can kind of think of? So let's just say if you are a startup, most vulnerability or most risks for startups is the market's unpredictability, it is capacity, it is sales and revenue, which goes back to cash flow, and it's the ability for you to build in the right talent for your business and deliver for your customers, right? Whenever I talk to big businesses, they say the two biggest concerns I have with small businesses is the communication, just communicate with me. And then number two, are you still going to be here? Because things hit you differently than it does for bigger companies. And so the strategies, if you're working with a startup, from a resiliency perspective, your strategy to help promote a robust culture of innovation or rapid response to market changes or to sales or to capacity and talent looks very different than what you're going to be designing and building from a nonprofit perspective or a big multinational company, right? If I think about a nonprofit, risks often involve funding, compliance, again, capacity, because they don't typically have the bandwidth, right? So how do nonprofits tailor those strategies so that they include risk assessments that are going to add value to them at their level, that align to the systems, how they manage funds, how they sustain their operations, and how they're able to weather the financial uncertainties to meet their mission? So I sit on a board for a significant nonprofit, and one of the things that we've been talking about is the data and what we're seeing about high net worth donors, where they're putting their dollars and where they're not, who volunteers and who doesn't, and what are some different creative ways that this particular nonprofit can build in some resiliency into their funding mechanisms, because grassroots donations are not just going to cut it to keep them alive. And their output is so significant in terms of who they serve, but the business model for how they're gaining those new dollars is not effective, right? And so what I'm noticing is that risk management is not just sometimes how we might see it in terms of, I got a plan, I got a BIA, I got to have BIA workshops. It's also at a senior level, how are we managing the risks and the threats of our business, and what processes or systems might we need to be thinking about to mitigate those? So how do we overcome some of the obstacles that we're facing? Because there are barriers to success always. So the way that we address those barriers, or how we identify and address those barriers to implementation, there's about 4 that we're looking at. So buy-in, resistance, breakdown, and communication and ambiguity. So lack of executive buy-in. I've heard people say that business continuity people should add value and you should start with data and metrics, and then the value is going to be there and your executives are going to buy in. And I don't know if I agree with that. I think it helps, but I don't agree with that. Not from what I've seen in my own experience. Buy-in is critical, because what I have seen is when we've asked our clients at that operational level, the people who own the plans, who own the playbooks, who own the function of business continuity, because it's other duties as assigned. When I ask them, what's the barrier for you being able to support this engagement to get this done? The number one thing they say is priorities. Does my boss know you want me to do this? So what's coming off of my plate for me to be able to do this, right? Because we know corporate, do more with less. And so from that perspective, you have to have executive buy-in and support. And your workforce has to be able to view these initiatives not with skepticism, but with, okay, this is my responsibility and I have a role to play here. Or they can't fear that their job is going to be lost if they participate So leaders have to communicate the benefits, the support, and the expectation. And it goes back to accountability. If you're asking your organization to do this type of work, what are you communicating so that they know what my expectation is? Resistance to change. Change creates discomfort. So if you were to ask me what's one word to describe the state of your company, I would always say change, because things change by the hour. And while I love change, I absolutely hate change. It bothers me. I'm pretty much like status quo. I go to this restaurant, I order this food, I go to this gym, I go at this time, I park in this parking spot. I'm pretty consistent in things that I do. So organizations can ease this by involving your employees in your process and providing your training or access to processes or systems that are going to help them to do this better. Communication breakdowns. It's paramount, it's critical. Without it, everything will fail. And then having clarity, right? So again, it goes back to clear is kind. The more clear you can be, the more kind it is. Ambiguous goals derail your progress. If you're not clear on what we're doing and why we're here, then what are we doing? I was in a meeting the other day, and it was a strategic planning meeting for a board. And the communication was, will provide us feedback on the strategic plan. And so I said, well, what type of feedback are you looking for? So they said, well, feedback on what you think. I said, is that the question? Or are you asking us to take what's been laid out and to build a strategic plan for how it's going to support each departmental and functional area across the business? Those are two different asks. Feedback to me is like, read the document, do I have any spelling and grammatical errors, and is it ready to go out? But your ask is really to help me implement and execute the strategy that we've just talked about and the goals. So let's be clear about what we're asking, right? So again, the better the question, the better the data, the better the results. So what are strategies for success? Foster engagement. Engage your stakeholders at every stage, at every level, to support the execution, offer insights, so that it can help to promote ownership and ease the resistance. People are people. So we got to figure out a way to engage them in the right way. Build a continuous improvement culture. There has to be a mindset of continuous improvement within the business. And then leadership roles or inspiring change. Leaders have to endorse, but embody the new changes. So, funny story, I was preparing for a meeting and I was really unprepared for my team. And I said out of my mouth, well, I'm just going to wing it tomorrow. And my team kind of looked at me and they were like, well, that doesn't reflect the core values. And so I thought about it and I said, okay, well, I'm going to have to get up at 6 a.m. so I don't have to wing it and I can be prepared because I wasn't prepared for this meeting. And so I didn't wing it, and thank God, because when I got on the call, the way that my team had to present their material and their data, I would have felt this small had I got on that meeting and done what I had originally planned to do, because I wasn't thinking about the core values that we set, the accountability that we have, and the way that they showed up was much more powerful than what I was thinking about. So I would have looked like I wasn't even an experienced member of the organization had I done that. And so it goes back to, in order to inspire change, it's a top-down approach. And even if you're in a big corporation, I think that's harder to manage with big companies and big teams, but everything starts with you, whoever you is. You set the tone, you set the standard for what's going to be. And so I think that's important for us to keep in mind to overcome some of these obstacles. So how do you measure success? It's KPIs and it's continuous improvement. Short story, we're working with an organization in their emergency management department, and we did a benchmarking case study across 6 different companies and their emergency management programs. And we looked at their size, their headcount, the administration and how it's managed, the scope of their programs, the budget that's allocated for their programs, the KPIs. And what was overwhelmingly consistent is that across these 6 organizations, no one had KPIs for how they measure success of their emergency management programs. And these are 6 organizations who are responsible for some aspect of transportation across the world. 0 KPIs. So how do you measure the effectiveness of your program if you don't have KPIs in place? So one of our recommendations was a list of, here's 20 different ideas on how we can think about what KPIs might look like to you and the organization. And then how do you quantify that, right? If you're spending time to prep your stakeholders to prepare for an exercise or to respond, you can quantify how much time that's taking and how effective that response was. But if we don't build a mechanism to do it, then we'll never know. So again, it goes back to what's the feedback loop? So some examples might be, you have your recovery time and recovery point objective. We have an organization where they went down for 13 hours. And so we learned that a partial outage cost them $4 million per hour. And it's not a risk that they're willing to accept. We look at business continuity preparedness. What's a composite index of how you can measure the readiness of the organization from response to recovery? You can put a number on that, right? Risk exposure, you can put a number on that. Incident frequency rates, you can put a number on that. And so these are things that we need to make sure that we're building in. It's not just about the plans, it's about the outcome of the plan, right? That's the bigger deal. What does this mean once it's executed? We were talking to a company the other day in the state capitol, and they haven't had a continuity plan since 2009. So I was like, wow, they went through the 08-09 financial crisis. I think maybe 3 elections that have changed and evolved over time. They went through COVID and everything else that's happened since 09 and now, and you've had no contingency planning. And so when we asked them, well, what's the goal or what's the measure of success? The leader's response was 28 continuity plans. And I was like, that can't be the goal. That can't be the goal.
You said I should have a plan. I have 30 of them. I am 30 times as prepared as I would have been.
That's a deliverable. That's not the goal. Just so we're clear.
I could give you 60. I could, is that better?
So with that in mind, how do we move forward? Set goals, establish timelines, assign responsibilities, allocate the effective resources, monitor and evaluate, provide a feedback loop, and plan for flexibility. Kicking it back to you, Scott.
It's funny. So thank you very much. I was thinking about this just in terms of, you mentioned startups a couple of times. I do a lot of work with startups. I'm a founder mentor at 1871 here in Chicago, and I was giving a presentation the other day on anti-fragility, one of my favorite topics, and it's a kissing cousin of this. It's the exact, a lot of the principles are reflected in here, and the struggles are the same, right? So a lot of what you're talking about in these points has to do with building not just clarity, but flexibility into the system. In other words, you need to give people the space to be able to do these things, right? To document these things, to practice these things, to know what to know what the correct action is, and to really own these things. And every minute they're spending doing that is a minute that they're not spending selling to a new customer or something like that. In other words, there's a perception that it takes away from the critical path of whatever the business is. I was talking to somebody I was talking about these principles, and the guy was kind of laughing at me in the audience, and he was like, we're growing as fast as we can. I've personally never coded before, and I've had to pick up coding because my three coders are overwhelmed, and you're talking to me about documenting processes, right? You're talking to me about that, like, I'm running in the red here, and it was a very difficult conversation for me to talk to him about. Do we have to make hard choices about how fast you can grow and how much your bandwidth is in order to be able to do some of these very important things having to do with planning for contingencies and having to do with documentation and delegation and accountability and so forth. Do you find that as well, the idea of I'm just too busy for this, or I'm growing too fast for this, or I'm overwhelmed and can't do this, and so this is very nice for the people who have the time, but because I'm in a run on the red all the time culture and way of life, this is not for me. Do you
Yeah.
get that at all?
The short answer is yes. I heard
Okay.
someone say before, and I don't know how true it is, but they said you become your clients. And depending on the
I
client, that
love
might
that.
that
Oh,
that
I love that.
that may or may not be what
Oh,
you
that's
want to
true.
do, right?
Yes.
So what I've experienced in thinking about startups is you get to a certain point of growth.
Hmm.
And in order for you to scale, you have to have infrastructure. Infrastructure is what we talked about today. This is
Yes.
what you build a house on.
Yes.
So you can't expect to successfully scale if you don't do it. So, which means you have to make a choice, right? So,
Yes.
and personally, I've seen small businesses say, we're going to pivot. And this year, I'm less concerned about revenue. I'm more concerned about getting my internal house in order. Because how can you go pitch your client if your house is not in order,
Right.
especially in the work that we do?
I don't want to limit this conversation to small businesses and startups either. You mentioned the managers who own these risks who prioritize, right? Remember that point you gave? It says priorities is the number one thing. What comes off my plate in order for me to do this? So I don't want to limit this to a startup conversation. Internally, there is a priority that something has to come off the plate, and what we're talking about is this is so important. Infrastructure is so important that, yeah, something does have to come off the plate, and that does have to come from leadership. And I imagine that that's a real challenge, getting that, get feeling like that you're fitting this in. Does that make, is that right?
It makes total sense. And I think when you're at these bigger companies where you have maybe more people, but maybe your capacity is different by department, what I do think you have is a different availability of resources, right? It's
Hmm.
easier for you to bring in an intern to come in and do this, or for you to pull from a resource from a different department. Or one thing we say internally is anything we're doing internal, get it to 80% completion and keep it moving.
Yeah.
So maybe you redefine what success looks like, because I don't have time to get it to 100%. But if I can get 50%, because maybe your 50% is somebody else's 70%. I think there's different ways that you can do it. But at the end of the day, you can't build anything without an infrastructure.
Right. I think that that's a great note to leave it on. I want to thank you very much, Vanessa, for joining us again. This material is wonderful as always. I want to thank everybody in the audience who is spending some time with us today. We appreciate you being here, and we're looking forward to you joining us for our next installment of Risk at Work. Take care.